thank you to all the people skipping their lunchtime to join this session. At Thoughtworks, we consider ourselves a sort of big global tech community made of thousands of passionate technology. So it's not by chance that we love interacting with and contributing to communities that talk about technologies. And today, for the first online-only XConf Europe, we asked people attending the conference to join, and even if for just one day, a global and colorful community and share their experience and ideas. And so thank you for joining us for the first XConf Community Radar session. And please remember that 3 lucky winners will be mailed next week and will receive some of our latest books. Joining me today are Ashok, Brigitta, Chris, Eric, and James, that are some of our most thought leaders here in Europe. And together we will go through the radar that you built in the last few days and last few hours. So I would like to start the conversation having a look at the overall word cloud of the technologies that you entered so far. So out of all the participants to the conference, some of you also joined the Bureau voting app session, and these are the technologies that you choose. And among them, it seems that infrastructure as code is the most voted one. And we featured back infrastructure as code in our radar in 2011, and our colleague Keith Morris wrote the first book about it in 2016. And by the way, there is another new edition under the way. And also pipeline as code and pipelines for infrastructure as code seems to be very well voted by our community. So my first question for the panelists is, why do you think that infrastructure as code and all its variations are still as relevant today and probably more than ever?
Shall I pick that up first then? Whilst unmuting myself. So hello everyone. Well, it's interesting what the debates we had during the last radar virtual radar workshop, which we did. We ended up settling on like a meta theme around I think it was X's software 2, which I think could have easily been called star as code. But I think what we're seeing, what we're continuing to see, is engineering rigor needing to be applied to new things. So things like infrastructure as code. Pipelines as code, pipelines for infrastructure as code, but also for things like machine learning and other techniques. We sort of seem to be repeatedly failing really to apply engineering rigor. So things like a lack of modularity in infrastructure as code. So even though we're using the right, we're using tools now and we're declaratively defining our environments and maybe even testing them, we still end up with these 10,000 line long bash scripts essentially in order to run them. So I'm pleased the community is also feeling that this is an important topic to discuss, because we're still needing to do quite a lot of work in this space. I don't know what the other panelists feel.
Eric or Chris or Brigitta, do you want to add anything?
I could venture an opinion. So I think one of the things about infrastructure as code is it reminds me of that William Gibson quote people use about technology all the time, that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So actually people's range of experience with these techniques is really spread out, and there are some people for whom are pushing the boundaries, like James mentioned, with using infrastructure as code for machine learning, and there's other people in their situation that are finding it hard to maybe implement techniques that are considered like earlier in the development. I think I can remember when Keith Morris's book came out that you mentioned, it seemed to be simultaneously a point in history where for some people it was obvious and for other people it was science fiction. And I think just in that area, there's so much change in infrastructure as code that pretty much everyone is feeling that little bit of uncertainty and anxiety that where they are in the journey isn't quite as advanced or as mature as where they look at their neighbor and they think their neighbor is. So I think because there's that volatility and because everyone kind of is wondering how they should adapt the latest developments to their practices, kind of everyone is spread out in a long line, and so there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, automation of your neighborhood is always greener this way.
Yeah, I think on it's also the entire landscape has been like evolving so fast, and the number of services that keep getting launched, is sort of exponentially increasing. And also the definition of when people talk about infrastructure as code, you talk about just pure managing VMs or containers, or all the way up to like serverless and PaaS sort of systems. In that entire spectrum, what good looks like is something that I think the community takes time to agree upon, as well as the proliferation of tools that exist in this space. And then I think I see this as a maturity thing, where in software, actually writing systems with software and getting testing practices into them has taken a while to evolve, where we now sort of accept that that's the best way to do things. I think in the infrastructure community, that's still a journey. I think we're still early on in the journey.
Yeah, I would emphasize Ashok's point about how it's evolving, right? James and Eric, do you remember like how old is this blip approximately? Infrastructure.
2 years, I think.
2011.
Yeah, 2 years. 2018. Yeah.
Now, this is the rewrite. The original one, I think, is about 8 years old.
Yeah. This is quite an old blip, right? And it actually just like resurfaced again on the radar, because we are still observing that it's like that a lot of organizations are still kind of slacking on this, or are still not using all the great tools that have come up. But also this, like it has really changed, right? The first time I became aware of the term, it was still in the context of like using Ansible and Chef and Puppet, and like in like at least in modern software development organizations today, we don't use Ansible anymore, right? We deploy Docker containers to Kubernetes, for example, and part of that is the infrastructure as code in a way, our Docker files and all of those things. So I think it has actually quite significantly changed what it is since the term first came up. So yeah, and this continuously, like Ashok said, continuously trying to figure out what does it even mean and what does good look like, because things and also basic concepts inside of it have actually changed, and the abstraction level has been constantly raised.
Yeah, so I actually did check it now. We had it on the technology radar in 2011 in January, so like over 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And I'm just reading the first sentence because it's actually quite insightful. It says, the large number of hosts and devices in a modern data center or cloud deployment have made manually installing and configuring infrastructure unwise. So this was more a problem, saying, okay, this is really not working very well. But then also sharing some experience. I was actually working with Keith, with a client here in Germany, in about 2014, 2015, when Keith was really beginning to have the idea about writing the book. And the tooling was very different at the time. We had started using AWS. CloudFormation was really, really painful. I remember trying to express if statements in JSON, and that wasn't fun. Then we started doing Terraform, which was brand new at the time and really didn't work for us. So we pulled that out. And then the client, I can actually name it, it's called AutoScout24. They actually started writing their own tooling called AutoStacker, if I remember correctly, because the tooling just wasn't there. And then later, of course, Terraform got much, much better and is now in many ways the standard. And now we see other toolings. But it really, even like the basic things like software-defined networking, setting up machines, and so on, even that wasn't easy. We knew the problem was there, but we didn't have the tools. And this, of course, has changed, which means now we can do all these things, extending pipeline definition, machine learning. There's a blip on the current radar about doing data pipelining and so on. So now we've got the basics down, and we're exploring further and further areas of application.
Yeah, back then it was all about avoiding the Snowflake server where you SSH into the server and change things and nobody knows what happens. And today it's about trying to avoid Snowflake Kubernetes clusters, right? Where you use kubectl to change things in the cluster instead of doing it through configuration and
the same, but at scale even bigger than was the original one. I think there is another tool that caught the attention of our community, and is Visual Studio Live Share. And probably this is also connected to the very peculiar period we are living all in. And my question for you is, what does it mean now and what are the challenging of doing distributed pair programming? We have been championing this technique for a very long time, and now we are facing the distributed side of it in this COVID or post-COVID era, as you like. And do you think that Visual Studio can help, or other tools like this can help?
I guess I'll pick that up again. I mean, my experience of actually using that tool in particular is pretty limited. I was actually chatting with one of our colleagues on Tuesday about the differences between being remote first and what we're doing now, which is working at home during the crisis, right? And how our practices need to change if we are remote first. So you don't spend 8 hours a day on Zoom calls, for example, obviously modulo today, because obviously the content's amazing. But I think some of the stuff around good pair programming practices for remote working, around making sure you've got defined hours, this kind of thing. I think that's super important, and kind of should form part of your team charter. But I'll throw it out to the rest of the panelists, because, as I say, my experience with this particular tool is pretty limited.
I think I would say the whole remote pairing thing has been is going through a journey on this part, and I think that one of my colleagues sort of described this whole technique is whether you're trying to do remote synchronous programming, which is what we're talking about from a pairing point of view, versus remote asynchronous, which is what the open source community has been doing for quite some time, right? So there's a distinction to be drawn in that as well. I think another thing to also bear in mind is, while these tools are useful to a certain degree, I think we also have to keep in mind the challenges and the evolution of some of the practices. So some of the things that we might be doing when you're seated next to each other versus taking that same experience and doing it where you're sitting, in different cities, is not necessarily going to be the same. So I think we've seen teams use a variety of different tools. I think we all look back fondly at things like Screen Hero before it was then discontinued by Slack, and then the founders have started their own tooling around this. I know JetBrains has something in this space as well. But yes, the experience, I think, I'd say from teams is mixed so far. It's probably which are the ones that you choose that are the best among the available options. And I think the fact that it was blipped in the radar is our broad feeling in this space is it's one of the better tools in the space.
Please.
Go on, Alexander. Maybe indulge me, because you talked about the tools that are available now, and obviously that's what people are focused on. But I think potentially there's the potential for getting more interesting tools that can do things with remote sharing that actually just being present in the same room don't do. Like, I've been reading some papers recently on shared gaze awareness that uses eye tracking to help people understand where the other person's looking. So while I know we're focusing a lot of this conversation on what we might lose in the new world, as with any technological disruption, potentially there'll be things that will come up that will be improvements over the status quo, or that will come back and influence the status quo or in-person pairing too.
This is a very good point. Birgitta?
I actually didn't necessarily, maybe just one point to add about the differences between tools like Visual Studio Code Live Share, I think it is, right? Or just screen sharing with something like Zoom is, of course, that this is like not pixel sharing, right? We used to always do things like remote pairing with tools that show you every single pixel that is on each other's screens. But there's now like more and more tools that help you in the different IDEs to actually more intelligently share, that they're more focused on what you're actually doing, which is writing code. And there's also tools now coming up for the JetBrains tool world, and this one is for VS Code. So I guess this one you cannot use if you're not using VS Code, of course, right? So there's like all these tools popping up now that try to make that experience of yeah, sharing your screen more specific to the task of actually coding. Yeah.
Yeah, there will be competition soon to Visual Studio Live Share. Eric, do you want to add anything?
No, I think I'm good with this one. I think we've covered that.
So now it's time to move to the radar itself, and let's switch to the first quadrant, the tools quadrant. So in this radar built by our community, there are at least 15 beliefs that are also present in our latest edition of the Tech Radar Volume 22. So what do you think, which are, in your opinion, the most relevant among them from our perspective? And the second question I would like to ask you is also, is there any unexpected or surprising belief?
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I've been tracking as people have been voting on this during the course of the morning. I've been sort of tracking where things have been moving around. It's kind of fascinating because about 20 minutes ago, number 18, Open Policy Agent, was actually an adopt, which was, you know, I think we have it in trial on our radar at the moment. But since this session has started, it's actually moved down to assess, which is actually, I think, slightly lower than we have it, as I say, in trial as opposed to assess. So I think that's interesting. One of the things, I mean, I'm quite passionate about event-driven architecture, if you can be passionate about event-driven architectures, but I'm quite interested in event-driven architectures. And it's quite nice to see that async API has made it onto the community version as well, because I think that's a new, interesting technology that's looking to build an open standard around, you know, formats for schemas for protocols around event-driven architectures. So that's good to see on there from my perspective, anyway. Anyone else?
Yeah. So what I like is, given in light of the talk that Monica and Marina gave earlier today, is to see that Trivy, which we had on the radar in November 2019, is actually in the adopt category. Trivy is a container security scanning tool. So it's good really to see that you as the community also like this. We probably would put it also in adopt these days. We don't have the room to put everything on the radar, as we often say, but that's really good to see that that is also widely accepted in the community.
I think there's a quite strong theme of other tools like that. If I look, like there's, you know, twist, lock, detect, Dependabot, tools that make it possible for you to be less likely to mess up the security of your application without having to concentrate. Like it's a case of computers are better at spotting some of these problems than human beings, and so getting humans to provide human beings with these warnings lets human beings focus on the kind of the core problem rather than administrivia or you know, security flaws they might introduce.
Any surprising stuff or unexpected one? Ashok or Birgitta?
Sorry, still out of breath. I just had to pick up a package. But something that I noticed was Git pod in adopt, because there was a bit of discussion when we put it on as well, or also about like applicability maybe also to enterprise software development as opposed to open source development. And it's interesting to see that, yeah, people are using this. So this is basically like an online development environment where you have like a project on GitHub, for example, and you just click a button and you get like a development environment with all dependencies for that particular project in the web browser. So that's interesting to see that people at XConf are actually using this, yeah.
I think that for me, when I look at some of the tools, especially in the assess space, it talks the trend more broadly about people adopting microservices or trying to build applications on, then trying to figure out, well, actually now they have done that, or adopting these architectures. The kind of tooling that you need in order to be able to support it, either from a traceability point of view, or even to manage something like, I think on the Slack channel previously, there was I think Chris had made a comment about Docker, using Docker for in a development environment, but the complexity in our tooling and I suppose the number of things that are also there in this space is just growing exponentially. So keeping on on track of that and seeing which ones actually move from like assess to trial to adopt. It's no wonder that a number of them tend to fall away as trends change and people's flavor of the month changes as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
A huge surprise for me is number 18, Yocto Project. So this is a set of tools. They've been around for quite a while to build Linux distributions. And we even had a discussion on is this part of the way that has been around forever? For us, it had renewed significance really because we are starting to see embedded software like on the larger scale, like say in cars, in vehicles, and in all sorts of other areas where we really need small size distributions, special distributions. And we found that the tooling was around, and that's why we listed it, because we said, okay, maybe we came across it, it works, maybe let's share it. But I'm really super curious to see how this ended up, like how many that people really knew about it and voted for it on the community radar also.
That's very interesting from an attendee's point of view, because we don't know exactly the profile of those people, but that's interesting. Okay, I think it's time to move to the techniques quadrant. And here I have to say that it seems that there is a huge alignment between the XConf community and also our radar. We have, I think, 23 blips that are actually matching also our latest edition. Again, the questions are always the same. In your opinion, which are the most relevant among them, and is there any unexpected result? But it seems that alignment is very huge.
Well, one thing I think is quite interesting is number 27 in Adopt, GraphQL for server-side resource aggregation. Now, this is a pattern I know in the UK we've used on quite a few projects. So I guess the idea here is you're still offering up sort of REST-based resource representations in JSON or in HTML as your API, for your API, but you're assembling those by using GraphQL to query lots of services behind the API, if you like, and then aggregating and serving up RESTful resource representations. Now, I mean, I thought this was quite a niche thing that we were doing internally. It's good practice, but I do find it quite interesting that it's been selected for Adopt by the community, because, as I say, I thought it was fairly niche. I mean, it's yet another of those set of patterns that you can use for doing ESIs, really. But as I say, yeah, I find that both interesting and surprising.
The thing I find surprising is data mesh in trial, because I think it was only recently been discussed, and I know our colleague Jamak, when she wrote this article up, there was a lot of debate as well, and we're still in fairly early stages in trying to understand the implementations, especially in the context of large enterprises. So I'm quite surprised and pleased that people feel, at least the XConf audience feels, it should be in trial.
One blip that was a huge discussion, or something that came up again and again in the last in the creation of the last radar, is here on the slides, is 45, managing stateful systems via container orchestration. And this one, actually, I think for us at the moment, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric and James, it's in assess, and it's kind of like use with caution, right? So this is basically about having your databases actually running, for example, like a stateful system, like a database actually running in a Kubernetes cluster, and the potential downsides that has, like managing something like that in a cluster like that instead of on a server. And so I'm just wondering, like from the audience here, if you put this in trial because you're using it or because you agree with us that you should use it with caution. So this was something that popped up again and again. There are a lot of nuances to it. So we didn't want to just say, absolutely don't do that, but we also wouldn't say always do it. So, but there seems to be, it definitely seems to be a topic on people's minds as well.
Yeah. Chris?
I remember seeing Benjamin Butler Cole from Neo4j talk about how they were using Kubernetes for stateful workloads, and kind of his comment on it, maybe to match what you were saying, Brigitte, is that, you know, think very carefully before you do such a thing. But yeah, I think it's hard to say, given people's different contexts, that it's completely a verboten thing that no one should ever do. But I would like take a deep breath personally before I do it.
And it was specifically, I mean, we couldn't squeeze it into the title of the blip. It was specifically around stateful systems that were not originally designed to be cloud native. So something like a Postgres database. Of course, you can always like stop a Postgres database server and it will recover and it has hot failover and so on. But the thing is, and that was the experience shared from a number of different projects with large scale applications, that it's a different thing to have this as a failover mode than to have this running in Kubernetes where the pods get killed every now and then and that the systems weren't performing as well. This is why we put this with a note of caution in, but Brigitte said this already.
Yeah, and what's also interesting, I think there's a hold blip in trial, the log aggregation for business analytics. So I think that's something that we put on hold, like using something like Kibana or you know, your logs to then get your business analytics. And yeah, it's interesting that it pops up in trial here, because I think it's something very tempting to do because it's easy. So.
Saying that legacy migration feature parity is in assess as well when we had that on hold.
Ah, interesting, yeah.
But then conversely, we really liked the platform engineering product teams to say that if you're building a platform in your organization and you have a team, really treat that platform like a product. And this is put on hold here. So that's also curious. I guess we will probably have a conversation in the Slack channel afterwards. And the Slack channel was added later. Brigitte just added it now before this session. There is one, you should see it in the default list of channels and you can join us there later. We are not able to monitor this right now while we're speaking, but afterwards we can have a look at it. Yeah, I'm super curious about those. Really, I mean, if something is between assess and trial, that's not so surprising, but something that we put on hold and the community thinks we should do and vice versa, that would be really interesting to figure out.
Eric, if you go ahead.
Sure. Sorry, I think exactly. I was just going to say maybe the context behind it and the understanding of maybe assess versus hold is maybe something would be good to pick up in the Slack channel later. Sorry, Chris.
I was just going to point out that in Adopt on this community radar, there is also applying product management to internal platforms, which in my mind is a very similar concept. So it might indicate something interesting going on with people's interpretation, because I guess for me, both of them are a kind of if you take what Nancy said in her talk about having a culture of why, and also, you know, thinking about who you're doing things for. Effectively, if you apply those basic concepts to a platform context, you arrive at this kind of product thinking. But then maybe some other people have different associations with what it means to treat something as a product, and they might have bad experience with that language, so they think something different.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have time to interact with the people that voted. So, but maybe if you want, there is a Slack channel, Community Radar. So if you want to interact with us, or even later, you can actually join the channel. Sorry, Brigitte, please.
I want to say that the platform engineering product teams, what I can imagine is that, you know, this could also be, maybe some people have in their heads, when they hear this, they have in their heads like the central DevOps team, right? You know, as an anti-pattern, you know, that there shouldn't be a DevOps team, but often in organizations, when they call a team a DevOps team, it's often a platform team, right? So I think there's something, and it's also about the size of the organization, when, like, at which point is it actually worth having this platform engineering team, right? And at which point is it maybe too early and you're just creating like a central thing that is hindering the speed of the teams, right? So maybe there's something in there about the discussion.
Sorry, just on that point, I remember one of our colleagues, Ian Cartwright, talking about a client where they decided they have this fancy new DevOps platform team. They announced it, you know, and they went from a lead time of something like 6 weeks to source a machine, and then put via a human to via an API 6 weeks to source a machine, because basically they just put an API on a bunch of humans doing exactly the same thing behind the scenes, which is that's not what we're talking about when we say platform engineering product team.
Okay, so I think that we need to move to the next quadrant, which is platform. People are asking if we are going to share those slides. Yes, we are recording, of course, the session as well, and we will make available also the radar later. Okay, so in the platform, again, there are few blips, but a lot, again, matching our latest radar, 10 of them. And the question is always the same for all of you.
I guess I'll pick up then on a couple of things that I'm quite familiar with, and that's in the .64 Istio, so the service mesh implementation, and then also 69 OpenTelemetry. So both, I mean, I don't think either of these for us are in, I think Istio is in a dot. But it's interesting that the community is also placing Istio there because, again, I think a bit like Chris was saying earlier, there's such a vast array of maturity in organizations adopting things like microservices, where, you know, the more mature see the need often for Istio, and the less mature don't necessarily see the need and don't actually adopt something like Istio. I think it's interesting that the community's put that in a dot. And then OpenTelemetry as well. I mean, it's so new, OpenTelemetry. So this is the merger of open census and open tracing in this sort of observability space. But it's really good to see that the community thinks it's a good idea. I'm guessing that's what adopt means in this case. Eric?
Yeah, big surprise for me. I'd like to hear more. Is number 83 Hydra on hold? That sounded like a really promising tool, and we had good reports about it. But it looks like other people have made different experiences. So yeah, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Chris or Ashok?
I guess for me, an interesting thing. I don't have extra experience on Hydra, but something that was interesting to me was AWS CDK, so Cloud Development Kit, which chimes in a bit with one of the questions that was asked about whether you should use first-class programming languages concepts to specify your infrastructure or something more declarative. So I've definitely seen people have good experience with CDK, which is kind of maybe a little bit of a reaction against the hyper-declarative style, but I think that that debate between those two styles is something that is unlikely to be settled in the near future. So it's something that fascinates me. But certainly I think CDK is well worth checking out and using if it applies to your context.
Yeah, I think for me, like Snowflake is one. I think Snowflake is beginning to see more of that in the big data world, where people are looking at solutions across multiple sort of cloud vendors, and whether you won't go with a native cloud vendor solution or something that you can then have some level of portability. I think we have it. I think we had it on trial in either the latest radar. So I think that's an interesting space to look at compared to the amount of tooling that's there in the space. It's one of the more promising ones.
Cool. Anything else?
And maybe worthwhile mentioning, again, number 81. Interesting to see that people know about it and have used it. So again, I'd be interested in hearing about experiences, because that feels a bit, I mean, it was for us when we put it on the radar, something that we only had very select experience with among the teams in the world. So more and deeper experience, quite interested in. I'm also super curious to figure out why and how Oculus Quest number 70 ended in adopt. And because it is one of the many headsets, it is a game changer. I understand that. But again, that could be an interesting discussion to have. I mean, for us, I think it was the beginning of 2016 when the first new style VR headsets came out. That was the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive. That was the first new breed. And in many of the offices around the world, we started buying a gaming PC and one of the headsets and started experimenting. And at the time, we really thought, that's it. This is now really virtual reality. This is now sensible. this can be used. Has reached a level of maturity in the consumer space that we can see used in the enterprise space. And we envisioned a number of different use cases. We experimented internally, also sometimes with our clients. And yet it didn't really achieve the breakthrough we had anticipated. And maybe it was still that the setup was too demanding, as in the hardware you needed, and the usage was too clumsy with the cord that connects you to the machine. So it's interesting to see when the Oculus Quest came out last year that, I don't know how much you know about it, it's a virtual reality headset. It runs basically the mobile phone chipset in the headset. So it works completely standalone. There's no cord, there's no setup needed. You don't need a PC. And how should I say, the visual fidelity, of course, cannot match a modern gaming PC, but it seems completely sufficient for an immersive experience. So it's interesting to see that people are saying adopt here. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing what will happen in that field.
And which kind of solution are going to be built on top, yes.
I'll just add something to that. I've been fiddling around with Unity development, quite the Unity gaming development environment recently. And I think, once you get to grips with Unity, it's incredibly easy to add support into whatever you're building in Unity for AR, VR. The problem, I think, is that getting familiar with Unity itself is such a massive barrier to entry that I'm not sure how many people actually get as far as that. But anyway, yeah.
Maybe on that note, we'll discuss it in autumn when we do the next radar. There is a framework called Babylon.js, which is a complete JavaScript browser-based framework. And we've done, here in Germany, we've done a prototype of an application that loads as a normal PWA, a progressive web application in a web browser. You can enter the URL on the Quest, and it gives you this immersive VR experience. And you don't have to battle with Unity, neither with the license cost and the licensing, nor with the thing. And you can just write JavaScript code, and performance seems to be at least on a very, very acceptable level. But Babylon.js generally works anyway. So that's maybe something we should add.
Yeah. Makes sense.
We are approaching the end of this session. I think we should move to the last quadrant, language and frameworks, which is one of, I think, most of the beloved and also most of the time controversial one among developers, because we all love a specific language or we are bound to a specific framework. So here, the matching with our own radar are few, so we have just 4 of them. And very quickly, I will ask you, because we have almost 5 minutes left, and we have to also do a quick announcements. So please.
I guess, one interesting thing for me is, Micronaut in number 86 in trial. We've had a lot of experience of that in the UK and our UK projects now, and I think very positive experience. It's almost for many of our teams becoming the default library or framework to use for microservice type stuff. So that's good to see people agreeing with that. Eric, have you got anything to say about Rust, per chance?
Oh, where did that end up? In trial. Yeah, that's also where we see it. I'm a great fan of Rust for a number of different reasons, and it's good to see how over the years it has become more and more adopted. It is the 5th year in a row the most loved programming language in the Stack Overflow survey, and in the market we're still not seeing that much use of it in the market. But I do really believe that there's a bright future, and many of us who write the technology radar and our colleagues, of course, who provide the input for the technology radar agree that that is something that we will see more of. And it was interesting, just a couple of days ago, I shared on Twitter a page that shows 7 new, very interesting command line utilities for Unix. And what unites them is they're all written in Rust. So we are beginning to see the areas where Rust really shines, that it is being used, and I think the success is there.
Yogita?
Yeah, something that I just noticed is that somebody or some people could apparently have bad experience with karate, which we have on trial. I think I just checked it, which is an API testing tool. So it seems like people in Thoughtworks have had good experiences with it, and there's some opposite experience maybe. Something that I noticed. React hooks, we also perceive it as like it's become the basically the default to work in React, right? And it's also an adopt here, so it seems to confirm that. Yeah.
Chris, anything from you?
Maybe I'll just point out Arrow. So there's a lot of Kotlin stuff on the radar. Arrow is a functional programming language, a functional programming library for Kotlin that kind of gives you some more of the advanced functional programming features. I guess I just really like it because it's beautiful, and it's it brings functional programming to Kotlin in a way that is Kotlin-esque rather than being kind of, you know, just a clone of something from another place. So I've seen Kotlin be adopted actually like as a improvement or a progression from Java in many places. So I think if you're someone who does like that functional programming side of things, Arrow is something that you might want to investigate.
So Kotlin plus Arrow, Chris, is that Scala the good parts, or?
Well, I don't really want to be in a position of being critical of any other approach, but I think that there's a nice progress from using the more functional parts of Java and wishing you could do more to Kotlin to Arrow. I have many great friends from the Scala community, and they do many great things with it. So I don't really want to oppose the two.
Shock?
I was looking as I was interested in Flutter in adopt. So feels as if, you know, there's this constant. We continue to see this constant challenge among our clients trying to figure out whether you go native or hybrid. And, you know, I think for a while React Native was the thing that we've seen most of our clients actually using, most teams using. I think Flutter is beginning to get more popularity in that space. I don't think the debate will ever die, but it's good to see that, you know, Flutter is also getting some interest in the community as well.
We left for the end the most interesting quadrant where fights arise and so on. So we are almost ending our time. There are 4 open questions in the QA session. I will rather invite you to post those questions on the Slack channel, which is community-radar. So we can go on discussing on those things later in the afternoon, if you like. And I think that we can move to the last few slides. So, of course, if you enjoyed this session, first of all, thank you all of you that participated in building this radar. And if you enjoyed this session and you want to replicate or build your own radar for your tech community or company, we added some few links, useful links. One is to how to build your radar, which is a very simple and straightforward tool that allows you to build and visualize the radar as we saw in the slides. And instead, if you want to use your own voting app, you can just git clone them from the open source repository and have it run in your community or in your company, deploying it to different kind of infrastructures. So I think that we are at the end of the session, and I hope that you enjoyed also the conversation about the Tech Radar. And this is something very important when you run such thing in your communities. Please keep in mind it is not about voting something, but is about having healthy conversation about technology. And please don't forget to check your email. You may be among one of the 3 lucky winners of one of our latest books.